A casual hoodie, a luxury showroom, and one jaw-dropping reveal. What happens when a dealership manager makes a misstep with a man who secretly owns it all? Darrell's modest SUV glided into the parking lot of Prestige Motors, the flagship dealership he had recently acquired. The scorching Arizona sun danced off the polished luxury cars parked up front, their glossy finishes gleaming like jewels on display. He chose an unmarked spot at the back, stepped out, and let his eyes linger on the sleek, modern facade of the building. Dressed in a plain gray hoodie, slightly worn jeans, and sneakers, Darrell looked more like a casual visitor than the man who held the title deed. His attire wasn't an accident, it was armor, a way to strip the facade and see the dealership for what it really was when its staff had no idea the boss was in their midst. As he strolled toward the entrance, the muffled sound of laughter and relaxed chatter filtered through the glass doors. Inside, a cluster of employees was gathered near the front desk, their conversation momentarily breaking as Darrell stepped in. The sudden blast of cool, air-conditioned air carried with it the faint aroma of leather and fresh wax. The employees cast quick, sidelong glances at the new arrival, their eyes lingering on his unassuming outfit. It wasn't overt, but the shift in their energy was palpable, a quiet ripple of judgment that Darrell didn't need words to interpret. He let it roll off him, his purpose clear. He wasn't here to be noticed, he was here to observe. Then she appeared, Susan. Her tailored blazer and perfectly polished heels announced her authority even before she spoke. The clipboard tucked tightly under her arm added an extra layer of precision to her brisk, purposeful walk. Her polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she approached, her gaze already evaluating him. "Excuse me," she began, her tone polite but distant. "Can I help you with something?" Darrell met her gaze, his expression calm and unreadable. "Just here to look around," he replied casually, gesturing toward the impressive lineup of cars. Susan's eyes flickered over his hoodie and sneakers again, her tight smile faltering ever so slightly. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asked, her tone laced with a subtle edge of skepticism. "Something like that," Darrell said, his easy demeanor unwavering. Her lips pressed together, and a hint of condescension crept into her voice. "Well, we cater to a very specific clientele here. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend." Before she could finish, another employee called out to her about a delivery. Susan hesitated, her gaze darting briefly to the interruption before snapping back to Darrell, her focus narrowing like a laser. Darrell raised an eyebrow, his voice remaining light but firm. "You're assuming I'm not qualified?" The question caught her off guard for a beat, but she recovered quickly, her posture straightening. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she said, her smile growing more strained. "These vehicles start at 6 figures. Maybe I can direct you to—" Her words hung in the air, met by Darrell's calm silence. He didn't respond immediately, instead turning to admire a sleek silver coupe nearby. His fingers grazed the door handle as he glanced back at her. "Nice car," he said simply. Susan's brows furrowed slightly, but her practiced smile didn't falter. "It is. Perhaps when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment. For now, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Darrell stepped back, his hands sliding into his pockets. "All right," he said, his tone neutral. "Let's hear it. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Susan blinked, visibly taken aback by his directness. She hesitated, then responded with thinly veiled impatience. "Maybe something a little more budget-friendly. I can give you directions to a dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles." Darrell smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's quite the assumption," he said softly, his words lingering in the space between them. Susan's composure faltered for just a moment before she stiffened, her smile tightening. "I'll be back with a list of options," she said, pivoting on her heel and walking briskly away. Darrell stood in silence, his gaze returning to the silver coupe. Its polished finish mirrored his reflection back at him, a reminder of the role he was playing. This was shaping up to be a very revealing day. When Susan returned, her clipboard was held like a shield, her brisk steps echoing on the polished floor. She stopped a few feet from him, extending a printout. "I've compiled a few options that might be more suitable for your situation," she said, her tone clipped. Darrell tilted his head. "My situation?" She nodded, her voice firm. "Yes. These are more accessible models, reliable, economical, and, well, practical." Darrell accepted the list, his eyes scanning the page. A used sedan, an older SUV, a compact hybrid. He suppressed the flicker of amusement that tugged at the corners of his mouth. This was going to get interesting. The paper folded with precision, disappeared into his pocket, and Darrell offered a faint nod. "I appreciate the effort," he said, his voice even, controlled. For a fleeting moment, Susan's stern facade wavered, her stance softening. But she wasn't one to falter long. Her hands found her hips, and her tone dropped, almost conspiratorial, as if unveiling a truth too delicate for the open air. "Listen," she began, leaning forward slightly. "I'm just trying to be realistic with you. Prestige Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Darrell met her sharp gaze with a calm, steady look. His tone matched his demeanor, cool and unwavering. "And what, exactly, makes you think I'm not your target customer?" Susan hesitated, her polished confidence flickering briefly. Then she straightened, her voice regaining its edge. "I've been doing this a long time," she said, her words clipped but assured. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth." "Out of their depth," Darrell repeated, as if savoring the phrase. His tone wasn't confrontational, but thoughtful, almost amused. Susan's lips pressed together for a moment before she forged ahead. "I'm just being honest," she insisted. "It's better to be upfront than to have someone leave disappointed." A quiet chuckle escaped Darrell's lips, and he shook his head slightly. "Honest, huh?" he mused. "I like honesty. How about this, you let me speak to the owner? Think we can make that happen?" Susan blinked, her carefully curated composure cracking for the first time. "The owner?" "That's right," Darrell said lightly, as if the request were the most natural thing in the world. "I'd like to have a word with them." Her lips twitched, attempting a smile that didn't quite land. "Well, that's not possible today. The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're a busy person." "I'm sure they are," Darrell agreed with a nod. "But maybe you could give them a call? Let them know I'm here. I think they want to meet me." The tightness in Susan's smile grew as her patience began to fray. "Look, sir, I'm trying to be as polite as possible, but this is getting ridiculous. I have other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying a car, we can schedule a meeting with one of our sales consultants. Otherwise, what?" Darrell interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge now. Susan's eyes narrowed, her frustration flaring visibly. "Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The tension in the showroom grew, palpable and unrelenting. Darrell didn't move for a moment, his gaze locked on hers. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "All right," he said, scrolling through his contacts. "I'll make the call myself." Susan's brows furrowed as confusion crept into her expression. "What are you doing?" "Just calling the owner," Darrell replied, lifting the phone to his ear. "Shouldn't take long." Her confidence faltered as she tried to form a response, but no words came. Around them, a few employees had paused their tasks, their curiosity drawing them into the unfolding scene. Darrell raised a single finger, signaling for patience, and turned slightly away. "Yeah, it's me," he said into the phone. "I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine, just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here?" Ending the call, he slid the phone back into his pocket and faced Susan once more. "They'll be here shortly," he said, his tone steady, almost casual. Susan stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. Who did you just call?" Darrell didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze swept across the showroom, lingering on the staff who were now watching with wide-eyed attention. Finally, he spoke, his tone light but charged with anticipation. "Guess we'll find out." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unspoken questions. Susan shifted her weight uneasily, her confidence crumbling as the seconds ticked by. Employees whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Darrell and Susan, the tension drawing them into the moment. Then the sound of the main doors opening shattered the stillness. A man entered, sharply dressed in a navy suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His expression was serious yet welcoming, and his eyes immediately sought out Darrell. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice warm as he extended a hand. "So good to see you." Darrell returned the handshake, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Thanks for coming, Alex. Appreciate it. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the room. Susan's clipboard nearly slipped from her hands as she darted glances between Darrell and Alex, the dealership's regional director. Mr. Carter, she repeated, her voice a whisper of disbelief. Alex turned to her, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. Susan, I see you've already met Mr. Carter. I didn't realize. You didn't realize he's the new owner of this dealership, Alex finished, his voice crisp. The weight of those words struck the room like a thunderclap. The quiet murmur in the room faded, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning as Darrell cleared his throat. His sharp gaze swept over the gathered employees, settling the room into an expectant silence. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began, his tone firm yet calm, commanding attention. For those of you who don't know, I'm Darrell Carter. As of last month, I am the new owner of Prestige Motors. A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Some employees exchanged curious glances, while others shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying embarrassment. Susan, seated near the back, sank lower in her chair, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Darrell continued, his voice steady. I came here today dressed casually for a reason. I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to understand what a potential customer might experience walking through these doors. He let the words settle, their weight pressing down on the room. What I saw today was disappointing. I was judged, not for my character or potential contribution, but for my appearance. He paused deliberately, scanning the room. This isn't about pointing fingers or singling anyone out. This is about the culture of this dealership. A culture that, from what I witnessed, doesn't align with the standards we should uphold. Susan shifted in her chair, her flushed face betraying her discomfort. Darrell's gaze briefly landed on her before moving back to address the entire room. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. This is about every person who steps through those doors. Every customer who may not fit into someone's preconceived notion of what a luxury car buyer looks like. A younger salesperson tentatively raised his hand. Darrell nodded toward him. Go ahead, he said. The young man hesitated, his voice nervous. Mr. Carter, I think most of us try to treat customers fairly. But, sometimes, it's hard not to make assumptions. Darrell nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand, he replied. We all have biases, whether we admit it or not. But trying isn't enough. We need to actively challenge those biases. We need to create an environment where every individual feels respected, regardless of their appearance, background, or anything else. He let his words hang in the air, scanning the room for their impact. This dealership has a reputation for excellence. And excellence isn't just about the cars we sell. It's about the experience we provide. From today, that experience will be built on respect, inclusivity, and fairness. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Some nodded, others remained guarded. Darrell's focus shifted back to Susan. Susan, he said, his tone softening slightly, I'd like to hear from you. Is there anything you'd like to say? All eyes turned to her. She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. I made a mistake, she admitted, her cheeks flaming. I misjudged you, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Darrell regarded her, his expression unreadable. Thank you for saying that, he replied. I hope this serves as a lesson, not just for you, but for all of us. Change begins with accountability. He turned back to the group. Moving forward, we'll be implementing new training programs. We need to ensure this dealership represents the values I believe in. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity. No exceptions. If anyone has an issue with that, speak now. The room remained silent, the weight of his words palpable. Darrell let the stillness stretch, his resolve unwavering. Good, he said finally, breaking the tension. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. This dealership will lead by example. He leaned forward slightly, his hands braced against the edge of the table. Let me make one thing clear. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came to understand the culture I've inherited and figure out how we can make it better. He turned back to Susan. Susan, he said, his tone soft but firm, you're an experienced manager. I'm sure you've worked hard to get where you are. But today was a wake-up call, for you and for everyone here. Susan met his gaze, her voice trembling but sincere. "I understand," she said. "I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Darrell nodded. "I believe in second chances," he said. "But accountability comes first. We'll discuss next steps privately. For now, let's focus on moving forward." Straightening, he addressed the group once more. "We're not just selling cars here. We're building trust and creating relationships. If you're on board with that vision, I'll support you every step of the way." This time, the murmur of agreement was louder, more genuine. Even those who had been reluctant seemed to relax, the tension in the room giving way to a sense of purpose. As the team began filing out, Darrell caught Susan lingering by the door. She approached him hesitantly, her hands twisting nervously. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice low, "thank you for giving me the chance to do better. I won't let you down." Darrell studied her for a moment before responding. "I hope you mean that, Susan. Actions speak louder than words. But I believe people can change, if they're willing to try." She nodded earnestly before walking away. Darrell turned to Alex, who had been observing from the back. "Let's schedule a staff meeting for next week," Darrell said. "I want to make sure everyone knows what's expected going forward." "You got it, boss," Alex replied, a note of admiration in his voice. Darrell walked back into the gleaming showroom, the polished cars reflecting the afternoon light. There was much work ahead, but for the first time that day, he felt a spark of optimism. This wasn't just about running a dealership, it was about creating something far greater. A place where character triumphed over appearances. And Darrell Carter was ready to lead the charge.